In August 915, according to contemporary chronicles, Pope John X did something no pope had done in centuries. He personally led Christian armies into battle, fighting alongside his troops against a fortress that had terrorized central Italy for 3 decades. When the final slaughter ended in the hills above the Garigliano River, not a single defender survived. Think about those numbers. 30 years. An entire generation of Italian children grew up knowing nothing but Saracen raids. Historical records document the systematic destruction of Monte Cassino in 883, one of Christendom's greatest monasteries reduced to ashes. San Vincenzo al Volturno burned the year before. Countless villages erased. And at the center of it all, a fortified Saracen colony controlling the road between Rome and Naples, seemingly unconquerable. By the end of this video, you'll understand how verified historical sources reveal one of medieval Europe's most sophisticated military operations. A 3-month siege that combined Byzantine naval technology, papal diplomacy, and Lombard military power to achieve what had seemed impossible. I'm about to reveal 3 documented facts that historians still debate. First, how Pope John X assembled a coalition from bitter enemies, princes who had been at war with each other for decades, coastal cities that had employed the very Saracens they now fought to destroy. Second, the Byzantine secret weapon that made escape impossible, Greek fire, the medieval superweapon that could burn on water and couldn't be extinguished. Third, why the Saracens themselves burned their own settlement before their final desperate charge. A symbolic admission that 30 years of occupation was ending in a single afternoon of slaughter. But here's what makes this historically fascinating. How did a fragmented, war-torn Italy, where princes fought each other more than their common enemies, suddenly unite for 3 months of coordinated siege warfare? What made the Hypatii of Gaeta abandon their lucrative Saracen mercenary contracts and turn on their former allies? Why did Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII commit his navy and his secret weapon to defend a pope he'd never met? And how did this battle, largely forgotten today, set the precedent for the crusades that would reshape the Mediterranean world 2 centuries later? To understand how a warrior pope destroyed what seemed like an eternal Saracen presence, we need to step back to 846, when Muslim raiders first taught Rome that even St. Peter's Basilica wasn't safe from the sword. The year 846 saw Rome violated in ways unimaginable to Christian Europe. Saracen forces, sailing from their bases in North Africa and newly conquered Sicily, stormed ashore at Ostia. They couldn't breach the massive Aurelian walls that protected the ancient city itself. But they discovered something that sent shockwaves across Christendom. The great basilicas of St. Peter and St. Paul stood outside those walls, unprotected, vulnerable. Contemporary chronicles record what happened next, with horror that still resonates across centuries. The raiders sacked both basilicas, stripping gold from altars, smashing relics, desecrating the tombs of apostles. For medieval Christians, this wasn't just military defeat. This was apocalypse made manifest. If St. Peter's could fall, what was safe? The raid on Rome was merely the most spectacular example of a pattern that had been building for decades. The Aghlabid dynasty, ruling from their base in North Africa, had begun the systematic conquest of Sicily in 827. That island became the springboard for something more ambitious than seasonal raiding: permanent territorial occupation of the Italian mainland. The numbers tell the story of Islamic expansion across southern Italy. In 840, Saracen forces captured Taranto, establishing a fortified base in Apulia that would endure for decades. 7 years later, they seized Bari, transforming it into a full emirate that would last 24 years until a combined Frankish-Byzantine force finally expelled them in 871. These weren't temporary pirate nests. These were Muslim states on Christian soil, complete with governors, tax collectors, and permanent garrisons. But the Garigliano colony was different. Around 881, the exact date is debated by historians, but most sources place it in this period. A group of Saracens established themselves at the mouth of the Garigliano River. They had initially arrived as mercenaries, hired by Christian princes too short-sighted to see the danger. The pragmatic, often cynical nature of 10th century Italian politics meant that Christian rulers regularly employed Muslim warriors against their Christian rivals. The Haipati of Gaeta, those merchant princes who controlled one of Italy's crucial maritime cities, were particularly notorious for this practice. What made Garigliano catastrophic was permanence. These Saracens didn't leave when their mercenary contracts ended. They stayed. They fortified. According to archaeological evidence and historical accounts, they utilized the ruins of ancient Minturnai, a once great Roman city abandoned since the 6th century, as the foundation for their fortress. Roman masonry, built to last millennia, became the walls of a Muslim stronghold controlling the Via Appia, the primary artery between Rome and Naples. For nearly 30 years, this colony served as what medieval sources called a ribat, a fortified outpost designed for ghazwa, or raids into enemy territory. But the settlement was more sophisticated than a simple pirate base. Historical analysis suggests it functioned as an emporium, a trading post, a transfer station for captives bound for the slave markets of North Africa. The Saracens at Garigliano weren't just raiders. They had created a functioning Muslim society in the heart of Christian Italy. The devastation they inflicted was methodical. In 882, raiding parties from Garigliano struck deep into the Liris Valley and destroyed San Vincenzo al Volturno, one of the wealthiest monasteries in Italy. The attack wasn't random pillaging, it was systematic annihilation. Contemporary monastic chronicles record that the raiders burned the library, killed the monks, and reduced centuries of accumulated knowledge to ash and blood. The following year brought worse. Monte Cassino, the mother abbey of the Benedictine order, founded by Saint Benedict himself in 529, fell to Saracen raiders. For central Italy, this was cultural decapitation. Monte Cassino wasn't just a monastery, it was the intellectual and economic heart of the region. Its destruction in 883 represented the collapse of order itself. And through it all, the Garigliano colony endured. Christian armies marched against it and failed. Sieges were attempted and abandoned. The marshes protected it. The Via Appia enriched it. For an entire generation, the settlement seemed as permanent as the Roman ruins it occupied. But the Garigliano colony was different from earlier Saracen strongholds in one crucial way. Unlike Bari or Taranto in the distant south, this fortress sat barely 80 miles from Rome, close enough that you could see the smoke from their raids, close enough that every papal election occurred under the shadow of Muslim swords, close enough that by 914, something fundamental had to change. Enter a pope unlike any who had come before. March 914 brought Rome a pope who would rewrite every rule about what spiritual leaders could do. His name was John, and he was already controversial before he ever wore the papal tiara. Born in Tosignano, a small town along the Santerno River, John had risen through the church hierarchy with a combination of political skill and genuine capability. By 905, he had become Archbishop of Ravenna, one of the most important ecclesiastical positions in Italy. He held that post for 9 years, working closely with the secular powers of northern Italy, learning the brutal realities of 10th century politics where spiritual authority meant nothing without military backing. When Pope Lando died in 914, the Roman nobility faced a crisis. The Saracen threat had grown too large to ignore. The traditional papal approach, diplomacy, prayer, and the occasional failed military expedition clearly wasn't working. They needed someone different. Someone who understood that defending Christendom might require a pope to do things that would make later church authorities deeply uncomfortable. The decision to elevate John from Ravenna violated canon law. Transferring a bishop from one see to another was explicitly forbidden by ecclesiastical regulations. The Lateran Council of 769 had reinforced this prohibition. But desperate times demanded desperate measures. In March 914, the Roman nobility summoned Archbishop John to Rome and elected him pope. Liutprand of Cremona, writing decades later with an explicit political agenda against the Roman nobility, claimed that John's elevation had nothing to do with capability. According to Liutprand's scandalous account, John had been the lover of Theodora, wife of Theophylact I, the most powerful nobleman in Rome. Theodora, Liutprand alleged, used her influence to make her paramour pope. Modern scholarship, including the assessment by Johann Peter Kirsch and other historians, rejects Liutprand's allegations as politically motivated calumny. The chronicler had every reason to delegitimize the previous Roman regime. He was writing in service to the German Emperor Otto I, whose dynasty sought to replace the Italian power structure. What seems far more likely, based on contemporary evidence, is that John was chosen because Rome needed what the Oxford reference describes as a vigorous and experienced leader, capable of confronting an existential military threat. John X understood something fundamental that his predecessors had missed. The Saracen problem couldn't be solved by Rome alone. The fragmented principalities of Italy would have to unite, an achievement that seemed nearly as impossible as defeating the Garigliano fortress itself. But John had an advantage his predecessors lacked. Through his years in Ravenna, he had built relationships with the secular powers of both northern and southern Italy. He understood the complex web of rivalries, marriages, and territorial ambitions that drove Italian politics. And he was willing to do something that would have been unthinkable for most popes. He was prepared to personally lead troops into battle. Multiple contemporary sources confirm what later church authorities tried to minimize. Pope John X didn't just organize the campaign against Garigliano from the safety of Rome. According to historical records, he personally led Christian forces in the fighting. The Oxford reference notes that he later recalled proudly the part he had personally taken in the battle. This wasn't a pope observing from a distance or blessing troops before they marched. This was a spiritual leader, fighting alongside his soldiers. The decision to take up arms was unprecedented, but it was also calculated. John knew that Italian princes would never fully commit to a coalition unless they believed the Pope himself was willing to risk everything. Words and benedictions wouldn't be enough. The Pope had to prove that defending Christendom mattered more than his own safety. But having the will to fight meant nothing without an army. And assembling that army from Italy's fractious principalities seemed like trying to unite enemies who had spent decades perfecting the art of mutual destruction. The Pope needed allies. What he found was a Lombard prince with a mind for war and a web of family connections that stretched across every power in southern Italy. Landulf I of Benevento had spent 2 decades building something more powerful than any army: a family. Every marriage was a treaty. Every child was a living alliance. Every in-law was a potential military contingent. The structure he created was masterful in its complexity. Landulf had married Gemma, daughter of Athanasius of Naples, binding Benevento to one of the most important maritime cities in southern Italy. His daughter Gaetelgrima married Guaimar II of Salerno, creating a direct alliance with another major Lombard principality. Then, to cement that connection permanently, Landulf's son Atenulf III married Rotilda, Guaimar's daughter. Through 3 strategic marriages, Landulf had effectively created a defensive pact that controlled most of southern Lombard Italy. But Landulf's diplomatic reach extended beyond marriage beds. In 909, he had traveled to Constantinople to receive the Byzantine titles of Anthipatos and Patrikios, honors that established him as a recognized ally of the Eastern Empire. This was no small achievement. The Byzantine Empire, still a major Mediterranean power despite losing territory to Muslim expansion, rarely granted such titles to Italian princes. Landulf had convinced Constantinople that Benevento was worth supporting. The chronicler Liutprand of Cremona, though biased toward Lombard princes over popes, records that when Pope John X sought advice on confronting the Garigliano threat, Landulf emerged as the strategic mind who could make the impossible coalition work. Liutprand describes Landulf as a potent prince whose military savvy was recognized across Italy. While Liutprand downplays John X's role to favor Landulf, the truth seems to be that both men were essential. The Pope provided the unifying cause and spiritual authority, while Landulf provided the practical military network. Here's where John X's diplomatic genius became clear. The single biggest obstacle to a unified Christian front wasn't Lombard rivalry or papal Byzantine tension. It was the coastal duchies who had been profiting from Saracen alliances for decades. The Hypati of Gaeta were the worst offenders. According to contemporary sources, they had been employing Saracen mercenaries from Garigliano for years, using Muslim warriors to maintain their independence against both papal pressure and Lombard expansion. This pragmatic collaboration had enriched Gaeta while fueling the very threat that now endangered all of Italy. John X faced a delicate negotiation. He couldn't simply condemn Gaeta's Saracen alliances without driving them into permanent opposition. Instead, he offered something more valuable than military threats: legitimacy and reward. John I of Gaeta, the ruling Hypatis, received papal recognition of his authority, the promise of territorial expansion after victory, and the prospect of Byzantine honors. The carrot worked better than any stick. Gaeta agreed to abandon its Saracen mercenaries and join the Christian coalition. The transformation of Gaeta from Saracen employer to Saracen destroyer represents one of history's more cynical political calculations. These same men who had hired Muslim warriors to terrorize their Christian neighbors now positioned themselves as defenders of Christendom. But in the brutal logic of 10th century Italian politics, past collaboration mattered less than present commitment. John X needed Gaeta's ships and knowledge of Saracen tactics. Gaeta needed papal blessing and the promise of territorial gain. The deal was struck. Naples followed a similar path. Duke Gregory IV, who had signed a formal treaty with Landulf in 911 as part of the Lombard alliance policy, brought his duchy's maritime power into the coalition. Docibilis II of Gaeta joined alongside his kinsman John, doubling the maritime contribution. By early 915, the impossible had happened. The Papal States provided spiritual authority and central Italian troops. Benevento and Capua unified under Landulf. supplied battle-hardened Lombard armies. Salerno added its military contingent through Guaimar. The maritime duchies of Gaeta and Naples contributed ships and local knowledge. From the north, Alberic I, Duke of Spoleto and Camerino, prepared to march south with heavy cavalry. And sailing south to join them all was the Byzantine Empire, with its professional military machine and its secret weapon. A technology that had been terrifying enemies for more than 2 centuries. That secret weapon was about to change everything. The Byzantine weapon that sailed toward Garigliano in the summer of 915 violated everything medieval warriors knew about fire. Water was supposed to extinguish flames. Everyone understood this basic truth. Throw water on a fire, the fire dies. Greek fire didn't care about basic truths. Historical sources consistently describe this substance with a mixture of awe and terror. Contemporary accounts document that Greek fire could burn both on and under water. Dousing it with water was not just futile. It was counterproductive, as the flames seemed to intensify when wet. The substance was capable of clinging fast to any material it touched, burning through flesh in seconds. And once ignited, the flames were seemingly inexhaustible. The exact chemical composition remains unknown even today. The Byzantines guarded the formula as the most closely held state secret in the medieval world. Modern historians speculate it likely contained petroleum, sulfur, naphtha, and possibly quicklime. But the precise mixture died with the Byzantine Empire. What we do know from historical accounts is that the substance was pressurized and heated before being projected through bronze siphon tubes mounted on the prows of Byzantine warships. The development of Greek fire dates to around 672, when a Christian refugee from Muslim-conquered Syria named Callinicos arrived in Constantinople with a revolutionary invention. For more than 200 years, this weapon had been a decisive Byzantine advantage in naval warfare. The Arab siege of Constantinople in 673 failed in large part because Byzantine dromons equipped with Greek fire incinerated the Muslim fleet. When the Bulgarians captured 36 siphon tubes and quantities of Greek fire in 814, they still couldn't use them. The system was so compartmentalized that no single person knew enough to make it function. The ships carrying this weapon to Garigliano were dromons, the primary Byzantine warship of the medieval period. The name meant quote, _3 in Greek, and they lived up to it. These were birames, 2 banks of oars, typically 120 rowers total, arranged with 25 oarsmen beneath the deck and 35 on top on each side. But unlike ancient Roman galleys that relied purely on ramming, dromons combined multiple propulsion methods, oars for precise maneuvering and combat speed, lateen sails for long-distance travel and favorable winds. The bronze siphon tubes that projected Greek fire were mounted on swiveling mechanisms, allowing the operators to aim the flaming stream at enemy vessels. Byzantine military manuals describe the siphon crews as highly trained specialists who understood only their specific role in the firing sequence. Again, compartmentalization protected the secret. The psychological effect was as important as the physical destruction. For sailors, the sight of Byzantine dromons approaching meant the possibility of death by unquenchable fire. You couldn't fight it. You couldn't escape it by jumping overboard. It burned underwater. Your only hope was to avoid it entirely. The Byzantine fleet sailing toward Garigliano was commanded by Nicholas Pichingli, strategos, military governor, of the Byzantine theme of Bari. While historical sources provide limited biographical detail about Nicholas, his role was crucial. Byzantine military doctrine, codified in the Tactica written by Emperor Leo VI, emphasized coordinated land-sea operations. The manual specifically discussed tactics for fighting Saracen forces, noting their mobility and recommending encirclement strategies that combined naval blockade with terrestrial pressure. Nicholas Piccingli would apply these principles perfectly at Garigliano. The Byzantine fleet wouldn't just support the land campaign, it would make victory possible by doing something the Saracens at Garigliano had never faced in 30 years of occupation. For the first time since 881, the garrison would be completely cut off from maritime resupply. Every previous Christian attempt had failed because relief ships from Sicily could break any blockade. Not this time. Greek fire controlled the sea. But as the Christian coalition would discover, the land itself was about to become an even deadlier weapon. The Garigliano River Delta in 915 wasn't just a location. It was a trap waiting to be sprung. Picture the Garigliano River Delta in the summer of 915. Not as tourists see it today, drained farmland and beach resorts, but as it existed then, 3 square miles of marshland. The ancient Romans called the region the Pantano, which simply meant "quote for," and for good reason. Geological surveys confirm that extensive wetlands dominated the delta, with 2 major marsh systems, the Pantano di Trieto and the Pantano di Sessa, creating a labyrinth of stagnant water, hidden channels, and treacherous bogs. The river itself, usually about 30 meters wide, carved through this landscape before emptying into the Tyrrhenian Sea. But the delta wasn't just marsh and water. Dense forest pressed close on both sides, ancient pines and birches creating a twilight world even at midday. Visibility dropped to 50 meters in places. For armies used to open battlefield formations, this terrain was nightmare geography. The Saracen colony stood near the ruins of ancient Minturnae. That Roman city had been abandoned in the 6th century, when malaria and barbarian raids made the lowland delta uninhabitable. The population had moved to the hills where modern Minturno sits today, leaving behind substantial stone structures. Archaeological evidence suggests the Saracens utilized this Roman masonry for their fortifications, essentially building a medieval fortress on classical foundations. Medieval sources refer to the settlement as a Kairuan or ribat, terms that indicated a fortified outpost designed for both defense and offensive raids. But this wasn't merely a military installation. Historical analysis indicates the site functioned as an emporium, a trading center where captives, goods, and information flowed between Christian Italy and the Muslim Mediterranean. For 30 years, this settlement had been a miniature Muslim state, complete with permanent inhabitants, economic activity, and social structures. The strategic value was obvious. The Garigliano Delta controlled the Via Appia, the primary road connecting Rome to Naples. Any traveler or merchant moving between Italy's 2 most important cities had to pass within striking distance of the Saracen garrison. The settlement could project power far beyond its physical location, sending raiding parties deep into Latium and Campania while maintaining a secure base protected by geography. That protection was formidable. The marshes that surrounded the Kairuan made conventional siege approaches nearly impossible. Heavy cavalry, the shock troops of medieval warfare, were useless in terrain where solid ground could turn to sucking bog without warning. Infantry could navigate the marshes, but slowly, in small groups, vulnerable to ambush. The forest limited visibility and prevented the kind of massed formations that gave medieval armies their tactical advantage. For 30 years, this geography had protected the Saracens. Multiple Christian attempts to dislodge them had failed when commanders realized that their armies couldn't effectively deploy in the delta. the natural defenses seemed insurmountable. But geography cuts both ways. The same marshes that protected the Kai ruin also constrained it. The settlement had limited space for expansion. Food had to be imported. And most critically, there were only a few viable routes out of the delta. Paths through the marsh that generations of Saracen raiders had used for their strikes into Christian territory. The approaching Christian coalition understood something previous attackers had missed. You didn't have to conquer the marshes. You just had to control them. Block the paths out, seal the river mouth, hold the high ground around the delta, and then wait for the defenders to starve. The Pantano that had been the Saracens' greatest defensive asset was about to become their tomb. The fortress that seemed unconquerable was about to become a cage. And the warriors who had terrorized Italy for 30 years were about to learn that sometimes the land itself chooses sides. Spring 915 saw the first blood spilled, not at Garigliano itself, but in the hills of northern Lazio, where Pope John X and Alberic I began the systematic elimination of every Saracen outpost that could reinforce the main garrison. Spring 915 saw Pope John X and Alberic I of Spoleto leading the Christian vanguard north from Rome, moving away from Garigliano toward the hills of Latium. The decision might have seemed counterintuitive. Why march away from your primary objective? But the strategy was sound. Before attempting the main siege, the coalition needed to eliminate every auxiliary Saracen force that could harass supply lines or attempt to relieve the garrison. Contemporary chronicles record that small bands of Saracen raiders had established themselves in strongpoints across northern Lazio. These weren't permanent settlements like Garigliano, but fortified positions at Narni, Orte, and in the Abruzzi region that served as bases for seasonal raiding and as potential reinforcement points for the main colony. Historical accounts describe these as small bands of ravagers that had been active throughout the region for years. The Christian forces achieved their first significant victory at Campo Baccano on the Via Cassia. The Via Cassia was one of Rome's ancient roads running north, and Saracen control of positions along it threatened the capital itself. Contemporary sources confirm this engagement as a decisive Christian win, though specific tactical details aren't preserved in the chronicles. What matters is the result. The Saracen band was destroyed or scattered. 2 more victories followed in rapid succession. Historical records document Christian successes in the area of Tivoli and Vicovaro, towns northeast of Rome where Saracen raiders had established temporary strongholds. Again, the chronicles don't provide tactical minutiae, but the outcome is clear. By late spring, the northern approaches to the Garigliano region had been systematically cleared of hostile forces. The strategic effect was immediate. According to contemporary accounts, Saracen fighters occupying Narni and other strongholds began falling back toward the main fortress at Garigliano. They recognized what was happening. The Christians weren't just conducting scattered punitive raids. This was systematic preparation for a major campaign. Isolated outposts were being eliminated one by one. Staying in those exposed positions meant being cut off and destroyed. The only rational choice was retreat to the main defensive position. For the Saracen garrison at Garigliano, this influx of retreating fighters might have seemed like reinforcement. More warriors to man the walls, more hands to hold weapons. But it was actually a strategic disaster. More mouths to feed during a siege they didn't yet know was coming. More men consuming finite supplies. The preliminary campaign hadn't just cleared the board of auxiliary forces, it had inadvertently increased the resource strain on the defenders when that strain would matter most. Pope John X's personal participation in these preliminary engagements established something crucial for the coalition's cohesion. Historical sources confirm the Pope didn't direct operations from Rome while others fought. He was present with the army, sharing the risks his soldiers faced. This wasn't common papal behavior, and it had profound effects on the campaign's morale. When a pope personally leads troops into potential combat, it transforms a military expedition into something approaching a holy crusade. By late May 915, the preliminary phase was complete. Every Saracen stronghold north of Garigliano had been eliminated or abandoned. Every auxiliary force was either destroyed or driven back to the main fortress. The Christian League had accomplished what no previous attempt had managed: complete strategic preparation. No relieving forces would arrive from the north. No raiders would harass the besiegers' supply lines. No escape routes remained open through northern Lazio. The systematic nature of this campaign reveals sophisticated military planning. Someone, whether Pope John, Landulf, or the Byzantine commanders, understood that siege warfare required more than just surrounding your target. It required controlling the entire operational area. Every preliminary victory was a piece on a strategic chessboard being methodically removed. The board was now clear. The main fortress stood isolated. And June arrived with the full might of the Christian League converging on a single target: a Saracen colony that had defied Italy for 30 years and now faced the reckoning that isolation brings. June 915 brought armies from every direction toward the Garigliano Delta. From the north marched Pope John X's forces from Latium, combined with Alberic I's cavalry from Spoleto and Camerino. From the south came Landulf I with the combined armies of Benevento and Capua, alongside Guaimar, the second Salernitan troops. The coastal duchies of Gaeta and Naples contributed both land forces and their knowledge of the region's geography. And from the sea approached the Byzantine fleet under Nicholas Pisingli, dromons heavy with marines and armed with Greek fire. Multiple contemporary sources confirm that by June, Christian forces had established positions on the left bank of the Garigliano River. The exact troop numbers aren't recorded in surviving chronicles, a frustrating gap for military historians. But the coalition clearly represented a substantial force. We're talking about contingents from at least 7 different political entities, unified under what historians describe as a rare moment of Italian coordination. The Saracen garrison found itself boxed into the marshy delta. Behind them lay the sea, where Byzantine dromons maintained a naval blockade at the river mouth. To their front, Christian armies controlled the high ground and the paths through the marshes. The fortress that had been impregnable for 30 years had become a cage. Nicholas Pisingli's naval blockade was the campaign's linchpin. Historical accounts describe the Byzantine fleet maintaining a rigorous patrol at the Garigliano's mouth, preventing any vessels from approaching or departing. For the first time in 30 years, the garrison couldn't receive supplies from Sicily. For the first time in 30 years, reinforcements couldn't arrive by sea. The Greek fire siphons mounted on the dromon's prows ensured that any ship attempting to break the blockade faced incineration. This was war of attrition, not dramatic assault. Multiple sources confirm the siege lasted 3 months, from June through August 915. That duration tells us this wasn't a single climactic battle, but sustained, patient pressure. The Byzantine military manual, the Tactica, explicitly recommended this approach against fortified positions: encircle, isolate, and wait for hunger and disease to do what direct assault might fail to accomplish. The besiegers employed the standard medieval siege tactics available to them. Contemporary accounts mention archers harassing the defenders from surrounding positions. Byzantine forces likely brought siege engines, catapults, and mangonels that could lob projectiles into the fortified area, without requiring close approach through the marshes. The Christians controlled the Via Appia, meaning they could maintain supply lines while the defenders' stockpiles dwindled. Inside the Kai ruin, the Saracen commander, some sources refer to him as Aliku, though this identification isn't certain, faced mathematics that grew grimmer each week. Summer in a coastal marsh meant disease. Mosquitoes breeding in stagnant water, dysentery from contaminated water supplies, heat turning stored food rancid, and every day the realization becoming clearer that no relief was coming. The chronicles don't record daily conditions during the siege, but historians can reasonably infer what a summer siege in marsh terrain entailed. For the Christians on the high ground, conditions were manageable. They could rotate contingents, maintain supply lines, and retreat to better positions when disease threatened. For the Saracens trapped in the delta, conditions deteriorated with no escape. June became July. July burned into August. Outside the fortress, the Christian coalition maintained pressure with the patience of men who knew they were winning. Inside, the garrison consumed food that couldn't be replaced, watched their water supplies dwindle, and understood that their 30-year occupation was approaching its end. Sometime in early August, the Saracen commander made a decision that sealed their fate. Surrender wasn't an option. Medieval siege warfare rarely offered generous terms, especially for Muslim defenders who had terrorized Christian lands for 3 decades. Waiting meant slow death by starvation. That left only one choice: a desperate sally. One final throw of the dice. A chance, however slim, to break through the encirclement and escape to either the coast or the mountains. But before they attempted that breakout, the garrison did something that chroniclers recorded with particular attention. They burned their own homes. In August 915, according to multiple chronicles, the Saracen garrison did something that would define their final hours. They deliberately set fire to their own settlement. The Kai ruin that had stood at the Garigliano Delta for nearly 30 years, the fortified colony that had survived countless Christian attempts to destroy it, burned by the hands of its own defenders. Contemporary sources explicitly record this act. The Saracens burnt their houses and attempted to burst out of the encirclement, as one chronicle states. This wasn't accidental fire from combat or siege bombardment. This was intentional, systematic destruction of their own permanent settlement. The symbolism speaks across centuries. For 30 years, this colony had represented permanent Muslim presence in Christian Italy. The defenders had built homes, raised families, created a functioning society. They had invested generations into making Garigliano a lasting achievement. Now, faced with inevitable defeat, they chose to destroy it themselves rather than let it fall intact to Christian hands. Historians interpret this act as recognition that territorial occupation was over. The burning was admission that they would never return. The settlement wouldn't survive this siege. The only questions remaining were how they would die and how many enemies they could take with them. The practical calculation was equally stark. Burning the settlement meant destroying anything useful to the besiegers. Food stores that couldn't be carried. Fortifications that might provide cover for Christian troops. Equipment too heavy to carry in a running fight. Everything that couldn't contribute to the breakout attempt was consumed by fire. The smoke rising from the burning Kai ruin sent a signal to the Christian forces surrounding the delta. The defenders were about to move. The siege was approaching its violent conclusion. After 3 months of patient waiting, the besiegers prepared for the moment they'd been anticipating. When desperation forced the Saracens out of their defensive position into open combat, where Christian numerical superiority could be decisive. The garrison's plan was brutally simple. Form for a mass sally. Attempt to punch through the Christian lines at their weakest point. Make for either the coast, where perhaps some vessels might have evaded the Byzantine blockade, or the nearby Orunsi and Massico hills, where rugged terrain might offer refuge from Christian heavy cavalry. The chances of success were minimal, but minimal was better than zero. Chronicles describe the garrison's condition after 3 months of siege. Deprived of adequate food, weakened by summer diseases endemic to marsh environments, knowing that relief would never arrive. These weren't men attempting a breakout from positions of strength. This was desperation made manifest. But desperation can be dangerous. Trapped men fight with the ferocity of those who have nothing left to lose. The Saracens at Garigliano had been professional warriors for decades. They knew their tactical situation was hopeless, but they also knew how to inflict casualties even in defeat. The Christian forces positioning to intercept the breakout would face fighters whose only remaining goal was to kill as many enemies as possible before dying themselves. As flames consumed the buildings where Saracen families had lived for 3 decades, the garrison formed for their final charge. They weren't trying to win. They were trying to die fighting instead of starving. The smoke and fire marked the end of permanent Islamic presence at Garigliano. What remained was the slaughter. Historical accounts document that Pope John X personally led Christian forces as the Saracens attempted their desperate escape. The spiritual leader who had assembled this improbable coalition, who had negotiated with bitter rivals to create unified command, was about to prove that he was willing to risk death alongside his troops. The trap that the Garigliano Delta had become was about to spring shut. Pope John X, according to contemporary sources, personally led forces in the fighting as the Saracen breakout met Christian lines at the river's edge. Multiple chronicles confirm this unprecedented act. A pope engaging in active combat, fighting alongside his troops rather than directing from a safe distance. The historical sources describe him as being with John leading the way, as the coalition intercepted the desperate sally. The engagement began near the riverbanks, where the Saracen garrison attempted their breakout. The toponym Battaglia, which simply means battle in Italian, still marks the general area in the modern municipality of Santi Cosma e Damiano, though the exact location of the clash remains debated by historians. What's clear from contemporary accounts is that the fighting was fierce and desperate. The tactical situation couldn't have been more one-sided. After 3 months of siege, the Saracen garrison was weakened by hunger and disease. They were attempting a running breakout against Christian forces who had been rotating contingents, maintaining supplies, and specifically positioning themselves for this exact moment. The besiegers were fresh, well-fed, and numerically superior. The defenders were starved, desperate, and in terrain, the narrow paths out of the marshes that funneled them into killing zones. Contemporary chronicles describe what happened with the clinical precision of observers who had seen many medieval battles. The Saracens attempting to flee encountered Christian forces who had been waiting months for exactly this opportunity. Medieval combat at close quarters was brutal under any circumstances. When one side consists of trapped, starving men, and the other consists of fresh troops led by commanders who had promised their soldiers the accumulated wealth of a 30-year occupation, the result was predictable. Historical records confirm the basic outcome without providing minute tactical details. The Saracens attempting to break through the Christian lines at the riverbank faced systematic slaughter. Some died in the initial clash. Others, wounded, fell into the marshes where recovery was impossible. The chronicles state that defenders were either captured or executed on the spot. which was typical of medieval siege warfare when defenders had refused quarter. But the riverbank engagement was only the beginning. Not all the Saracen defenders died in that first clash. Some managed to break through the initial Christian lines or found gaps in the encirclement. These survivors made for the hills, the Oronchi and Massico mountains that rose beyond the delta, offering the hope of terrain too rugged for effective Christian pursuit. It was a reasonable hope. Medieval heavy cavalry, the shock troops that dominated European warfare, were indeed less effective in mountain terrain. If the Saracens could reach the heights and disappear into the forest, some might survive to fight another day or escape to Muslim-held territory in the south. They had forgotten who was leading the pursuit. Alberic I of Spoleto had built his power in central Italy through decades of mountain warfare. His cavalry knew how to operate in difficult terrain. And after 3 months of siege, after all the diplomatic effort to assemble this coalition, after bringing forces from across Italy for this single campaign, the Christian commanders weren't about to let any defenders escape. The pursuit that followed would be described in later accounts as, quote, 11. Those who survived the riverbank ran for the hills. The hills offered no mercy. According to contemporary accounts, Saracen defenders who broke through the initial Christian lines attempted retreat toward the Oronchi and Massico mountains. The rugged terrain seemed to promise what the marshes had failed to provide: sanctuary from Christian pursuit. If they could reach the heights and disperse into the forests, some might evade capture. Perhaps a few could eventually make their way south to Muslim-held Sicily. It was a desperate plan, but desperation was all that remained. Alberic I of Spoleto and Landulf I of Benevento led what historical sources describe as a relentless pursuit. These weren't commanders who had spent months assembling a coalition only to let the enemy escape at the final moment. The pursuit was systematic and merciless. The Saracens discovered that mountain terrain offered less protection than they'd hoped. Yes, heavy cavalry was slower in rough country, but slower didn't mean stopped. And the Christian forces had something the fleeing defenders lacked: knowledge that organized pursuit beats panicked flight. The Saracens weren't retreating in formation. They were running for their lives. Individual fighters or small groups, each seeking their own escape route, many wounded, all exhausted. Contemporary chronicles record that the Saracens were, quote, 12. That phrasing suggests that the pursuing Christians didn't just chase randomly, but employed coordinated tactics to drive the fleeing defenders into dead ends. Ravines with no exit, ridge lines that turned into traps, forest clearings surrounded by waiting troops. This was hunting, not battle. The slaughter in the hills was the final act of the Garigliano campaign. Medieval siege warfare, especially when defenders had inflicted decades of terror on the besiegers' homeland, rarely ended with generous quarter. The chronicles explicitly state that, quote, 13. That phrasing appears in multiple sources, suggesting it was the documented reality rather than propaganda exaggeration. Some Saracens, perhaps the strongest or fastest, managed to evade the pursuit long enough to reach the coast. Historical accounts suggest that a few defenders hoped to find vessels that had evaded the Byzantine blockade, desperate to reach the sea and somehow escape to Sicily. They discovered that Nicholas Picingli's dromons were still patrolling the maritime escape routes. The Byzantine fleet, according to contemporary sources, continued intercepting any attempt at seaborne escape. Vessels attempting to flee were either captured or sunk. The Greek fire that had maintained the blockade for 3 months ensured that the sea offered no more sanctuary than the hills. Every escape route was closed. Every avenue to survival was blocked. By the time the sun set on that August day, The Saracen presence at Garigliano, which had endured since 881, which had survived countless Christian attempts to dislodge it, which had seemed as permanent as the Roman ruins it occupied, was completely erased. The chronicles are unambiguous on this point. Not a single defender survived to tell their side of the story. The only accounts of the battle that exist are Christian. The Saracen perspective died with the garrison. The totality of the victory was unusual, even by medieval standards. Siege warfare often ended with at least some prisoners taken for ransom or slave labor. But at Garigliano, the combination of 3 decades of accumulated Christian rage, the strategic importance of ensuring no survivors could rebuild the colony, and the brutality that characterized religious warfare resulted in complete annihilation. The numbers that would define Garigliano's legacy weren't the troop counts. Those weren't recorded. The defining number was simpler and more absolute. 0. 0 survivors. 0 Saracen accounts. 0 chance that this fortress would ever threaten Rome again. Where the Ruin had stood for 30 years, only blackened stone and silence remained. Where the Ruin had stood for 30 years, only blackened stone and silence remained. The settlement the Saracens burned before their final sally lay in ruins. The flames had consumed wooden structures. The stone foundations, salvaged from ancient Minturni's Roman masonry, stood scorched but intact. Mute testimony to the impermanence of human occupation compared to imperial architecture, contemporary sources confirm that the site was never reoccupied. After 915, the Garigliano Delta returned to the marshland emptiness it had maintained between Minturni's abandonment in the 6th century and the Saracen arrival in 881. The 30-year Muslim presence was erased as thoroughly as if it had never existed. Archaeological and historical evidence indicates that the delta remained largely uninhabited for centuries after the battle. The marshes that had protected the Saracens, the same marshes that had trapped them, made the region unsuitable for permanent settlement. It wasn't until the massive land reclamation projects of the 20th century that the Pantano was finally drained and converted to farmland. The battlefield itself preserved few physical traces. The chronicles don't describe what equipment or possessions the fleeing Saracens abandoned, though we can reasonably assume that weapons, armor, and personal items were scattered across the hills where the final pursuit occurred. The strategic value of the victory didn't lie in captured material. It lay in what had been permanently removed. The Via Appia, which the Saracen garrison had controlled and exploited for 30 years, returned to Christian hands. Travelers between Rome and Naples no longer faced the threat of Muslim raiders. Merchants could move goods without paying protection money to the Ruin. Pilgrims traveling to holy sites no longer risked capture and enslavement. The commercial and spiritual arteries of central Italy had been restored. The transformation was geographic, economic, and psychological. For an entire generation of Italians, Saracen presence at Garigliano had been a fact of life. Children born in 881 and still alive in 915 had never known a time when the Muslim colony didn't threaten central Italy. That threat had become normalized, assumed permanent. Its sudden and total removal must have seemed almost incomprehensible, but the most significant aspect of the aftermath wasn't what was visible on the battlefield. It was what happened in the political realm, where victories transform into power and power transforms into opportunity for those willing to seize it. The men who destroyed the Garigliano garrison had earned political capital in Saracen blood. Now came the reckoning of who would collect on that debt and at what price. December 915 brought the first payment, and it was delivered in gold and ritual in the heart of Rome itself. December 3rd, 915. St. Peter's Basilica. A political transaction disguised as religious ceremony was about to reshape Italian power structures. Berengar I of Friuli had been king of Italy since 887, a reign of 28 years marked by constant challenges to his authority. He had faced no fewer than 7 rival claimants to the Italian throne during his long struggle for supremacy. In 905, he had captured his most dangerous rival, Louis of Provence, and had him blinded to eliminate him as a future threat. Berengar had ruled through a combination of military force, political maneuvering, and sheer stubborn persistence. But he had never been Holy Roman Emperor. That title, with its prestige and legitimacy, had eluded him. Pope John X held the power to grant it, and John was willing to trade sacred authority for military support. Historical sources make the transaction explicit. In January 915, when John began organizing the coalition against Garigliano, he approached Berengar with a straightforward exchange. Berengar would provide northern Italian troops to support the campaign. In return, John would grant him the imperial coronation that Berengar had sought for years. Berengar kept his end of the bargain. While he couldn't personally campaign south, Magyar raids in the north required his presence in Friuli. He sent a substantial contingent under the command of Alberic I. Those troops participated in both the preliminary campaigns and the final siege. Berengar had delivered. Now John would deliver. Contemporary chronicles record Berengar's approach to Rome in December 915. He was greeted by the family of Theophylact I, the most powerful nobleman in the city and John's key secular ally. The reception demonstrated that Berengar's coronation had the backing of both papal and noble authority, crucial for legitimacy in Rome's complex political landscape. On December 3, 915, Pope John X crowned Berengar as Holy Roman Emperor in St. Peter's Basilica. The ceremony would have followed the traditional format: anointing with holy oil, investiture with the symbols of imperial authority, and the placement of the crown upon Berengar's head. At approximately 70 years old, Berengar finally achieved the title he had sought for decades. The coronation carried historical significance beyond the personal achievement. Contemporary sources note that this was the last time a unified Christian league of Italian powers would acknowledge a single emperor before the rise of the Ottonian dynasty later in the century. After Berengar, no emperor would successfully unite Italian political authority until Otto I was crowned in 962, a gap of 38 years. The Garigliano coalition represented a brief moment of Italian unity that would immediately dissolve after the victory that created it. Berengar's triumph was short-lived. Historical records show he returned north immediately after the coronation, where Magyar threats continued to plague his kingdom. He would rule as emperor for 9 years, but those years brought constant conflict. In 922, a group of Italian noblemen invited Rudolf II of Burgundy to challenge Berengar. Rudolf defeated Berengar at Fiorenzuola in 923. The following spring, in 924, Berengar was murdered by one of his own men, possibly at Rudolf's instigation. The imperial crown John X had granted didn't save Berengar from assassination. But the coronation had served its purpose for both parties. Berengar got the legitimacy he craved. John got the military support that destroyed Garigliano. That the coalition immediately fractured and its leaders soon died violently was simply the nature of 10th century Italian politics. Berengar wasn't the only coalition member collecting rewards. Across Italy, the victors of Garigliano were cashing in on political capital earned through 3 months of siege warfare and 1 afternoon of slaughter. And those rewards came with consequences that would tear apart the very alliance that had made victory possible. victory at Garigliano made heroes. Heroes became powerful. And power, as Rome would learn, destroys its makers. Alberic I of Spoleto emerged from the campaign as one of the most prominent military commanders in Italy. Contemporary sources document that in 917, just 2 years after Garigliano, he was appointed consul of the Romans, a prestigious title that gave him tremendous influence in Rome's political affairs. His marriage to Marozia, daughter of Theophylact I, had already connected him to Rome's most powerful family. Now military glory elevated him further. But the historical sources document a darker transformation. The hero who had led Christian cavalry against Saracen defenders became what chronicles describe as a tyrant. The exact nature of his oppression isn't detailed in surviving accounts, but the result is clear. Both the Pope and the Roman people expelled him from the city. Alberic retreated to his stronghold at Orte, where he would meet a violent end. Multiple sources confirm he was murdered sometime between 924 and 926, likely killed by enemies he had made during his tyrannical rule in Rome. John I of Gaeta, the Hypatus who had abandoned his Saracen mercenary contracts to join the Christian coalition, received substantial rewards. Historical records document that he was granted the territory of Trito, expanding his duchy's holdings to include the Garigliano Delta itself. Ironic that the former employer of Saracens now controlled the land where their colony had stood. The Byzantine Empire granted him the title of Patricios, a significant honor that elevated his family's status. The Hypatai of Gaeta subsequently proclaimed themselves Quote 15, a permanent upgrade in noble rank that endured for generations. The coastal duchies had made the cynical calculation correctly. Abandoning their Saracen allies and joining the Christian coalition had been far more profitable than maintaining the old mercenary arrangements. Gaeta transformed from problematic papal neighbor to loyal ally, at least nominally. The pragmatic nature of 10th century Italian politics meant that past collaboration with Muslims was forgiven when present collaboration with Christians proved lucrative. But the most dramatic and tragic consequence of Garigliano's victory played out in the life of Pope John X himself. The warrior pope who had personally led troops, who had assembled an impossible coalition, who had achieved what decades of previous attempts had failed to accomplish, would not die peacefully in his bed. By 928, the fragile unity that John had created had completely collapsed. Marozia, widow of Alberic I and daughter of Theophylact, had become one of the most powerful figures in Rome. She married Guy of Tuscany, creating a new power alliance that viewed John as an obstacle rather than an ally. The political landscape had shifted. The Pope, who had been essential for defeating Saracens, was now inconvenient for Roman noble ambitions. Contemporary chronicles record that Marozia had Pope John X deposed and imprisoned in the Lateran Palace. The warrior pope, the man who had fought alongside his troops at Garigliano, was locked in a dungeon by the widow of his former ally. And there, according to multiple historical sources, John X was murdered. The man who had personally risked death in battle was killed by political assassination. The date is recorded as 928, just 13 years after his greatest triumph. This period in papal history is known by names that capture its darkness. Historians call it the Saeculum Obscurum, the Dark Age, or sometimes the Pornocracy, a term suggesting the dominance of corrupt secular powers over the papacy. The Theophylact family, later succeeded by the Crescentii dynasty, effectively controlled the papal office for much of the 10th century. Popes were installed and removed based on noble faction politics rather than spiritual merit. The irony is impossible to ignore. Pope John X assembled the Christian League. Theophylact I provided crucial support. Alberic I led troops. Within 13 years of Garigliano, John was murdered in prison, Theophylact was dead, and Alberic had been killed by his enemies. Berengar I, who received the imperial crown as reward for his participation, was assassinated by his own men in 924. The architects of victory destroyed by their own allies and ambitions. The coalition that had seemed impossible to create proved equally impossible to maintain. Italian unity had lasted exactly as long as the common enemy remained threatening. Once the Saracens were annihilated, the princes returned to their natural state, mutual destruction. But while the individuals who won at Garigliano destroyed themselves, the victory itself endured. The question was what that victory meant beyond the personal fates of those who achieved it. August 915 didn't just destroy a garrison. It destroyed a model of Islamic expansion that had worked for nearly a century. The broader pattern of Saracen presence in Italy had been building since the early 9th century. The conquest of Sicily, begun in 827, had transformed that island into a Muslim state that would endure until Norman conquest in the 11th century. From Sicily, Saracen forces had established permanent territorial footholds on the Italian mainland. Taranto, occupied in 840, became a Muslim stronghold in Apulia. Bari was transformed into an emirate that functioned as an independent Muslim state from 847 until 871, when combined Frankish and Byzantine forces finally expelled the occupiers. These weren't temporary raids. These were permanent occupations with governors, taxation systems, and settled populations. The pattern seemed clear. Islam was establishing permanent territorial presence in Christian Italy. Colony by colony, emirate by emirate, Garigliano represented the northernmost and most threatening example of this expansion. At barely 80 miles from Rome, the colony could project power directly into the heart of Christendom. For 30 years, it had demonstrated that Muslim forces could not only raid, but settle. Not only attack, but permanently occupy Christian land within striking distance of St. Peter's throne. The 915 campaign ended that pattern decisively. Historical analysis of the subsequent centuries shows that after Garigliano, the nature of Saracen military activity fundamentally changed. The shift wasn't immediate. Muslim raids continued to plague coastal Italy throughout the 10th century. In 1005, a Christian fleet from Pisa sacked Arab-held Reggio Calabria. Sporadic incursions remained a threat well into the 11th century. But no Saracen force ever again established a permanent territorial base in central Italy. The pattern shifted from occupation to raiding, from permanent presence to seasonal incursions. Muslim naval forces would continue to harass Italian coasts, but they operated from bases in North Africa or Sicily, not from colonies on the mainland. The strategic significance becomes clear when we compare Garigliano to earlier Christian victories. The fall of Bari in 871 had eliminated the Muslim emirate in Apulia, but Saracen forces simply established themselves elsewhere. Defeats were temporary setbacks in a broader pattern of expansion. Garigliano was different. After 915, as documented by the absence of such settlements in subsequent chronicles, permanent mainland occupation ended permanently. Several factors explain why Garigliano marked this definitive turning point. The completeness of the victory, 0 survivors. Total annihilation. Sent a message that simply wasn't present in earlier Christian successes, where Muslim forces were expelled but allowed to retreat. The 3-month siege and systematic elimination of all auxiliary forces demonstrated a level of Christian strategic coordination previously rare in Fragmented Italy, and the Byzantine naval blockade using Greek fire established that future attempts at permanent settlement would face maritime isolation they couldn't overcome. The monasteries devastated by Garigliano raiders began the slow process of recovery. Monte Cassino, destroyed in 883, was eventually rebuilt, though it remained vulnerable to later raids. San Vincenzo al Volturno's restoration took longer, but the intellectual centers of central Italy gradually recovered. The Via Appia, controlled by Saracens for 3 decades, returned to serving its original purpose as a secure route between Rome and Naples. But Garigliano's influence reached beyond preventing future Muslim colonies. The battle established something unprecedented in Italian military history: a successful template for coordinated Christian coalition warfare against Islamic forces. The lessons learned at Garigliano: papal leadership providing unified command, multiple principalities contributing forces under single strategic direction, Byzantine naval power complementing Italian land armies, patient siege warfare rather than hasty assaults, would echo in later Christian military efforts. Those echoes would be heard most clearly 2 centuries later, in a much larger theater, when another pope called for Christian forces to unite against Muslim armies. When Pope Urban II called for crusade in 1095, he may or may not have consciously known the details of Pope John X's campaign 180 years earlier. But the structural parallels between Garigliano and the First Crusade are striking enough that historians have noted the pattern. Consider the core elements of Garigliano. A pope provided the initial call to arms, framing military action as religious duty and offering spiritual authority to unify secular powers. Multiple Christian states, normally rivals or enemies, agreed to set aside their conflicts and contribute forces to a common campaign. Byzantine military power, professional troops, and advanced naval technology supported the Italian Christian forces. The campaign combined land and sea operations under coordinated command, and the justification was explicitly defensive, protecting Christian territory and people from Islamic aggression. Now consider the First Crusade. Pope Urban II issued the call at Clermont in 1095. Multiple European kingdoms and principalities contributed forces under separate commanders, but notionally unified purpose. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos requested Western military support and provided logistical assistance. The crusading armies combined with Byzantine naval power in amphibious operations. And the initial justification, though it evolved, was defending Eastern Christians and recovering occupied Christian lands. The parallels extend to specific tactical and strategic patterns. Both campaigns emphasized siege warfare. Garigliano was a 3-month siege, while the First Crusade's success relied heavily on successful sieges of Antioch and Jerusalem. Both featured coalition armies, where maintaining unity was as challenging as defeating the enemy. Both relied on Byzantine naval power to maintain supply lines and prevent Muslim reinforcement. Both featured religious leaders taking unprecedented military roles. John X fighting personally, Urban II's legates accompanying crusading armies. Historians debate whether direct institutional memory connected Garigliano to later crusading. The papal chancery maintained archives, and certainly some records of John X's campaign would have been available in 1095. But 2 centuries is long enough that specific tactical lessons might have been lost while general patterns endured. What seems more likely is that Garigliano established a precedent that became embedded in how the papacy understood its role in coordinating Christian military action against Islamic forces. The provided academic analysis characterizes Garigliano as setting a precedent for collective defense of the Western world that would find its ultimate expression in the Crusades. That assessment recognizes that while proving direct causation is difficult, the pattern similarities suggest at minimum a recurring template for how Christian Europe organized military responses to Islamic territorial pressure. The differences between Garigliano and the Crusades are equally instructive. Garigliano was a regional Italian campaign, while the Crusades were international European efforts. Garigliano succeeded in permanently removing the immediate threat. No Saracen colonies reappeared in central Italy. The Crusades, despite initial victories, ultimately failed to maintain permanent Christian control of the Levant. The Crusader states established after the First Crusade were gone within 2 centuries. Perhaps the key distinction is scale of ambition. Garigliano aimed to eliminate a specific military threat to a specific region. The Crusades attempted to reconquer and permanently hold territory thousands of miles from Christian power centers. Garigliano's limited, achievable objectives succeeded. The Crusades' expansive, ambitious goals eventually failed. But whether or not crusading popes consciously remembered John X's campaign, Garigliano proved something crucial for Christian military thought. It demonstrated that fragmented Christian powers could unite when survival demanded it. That papal authority could transcend regional politics when properly exercised. That patient, coordinated siege warfare could overcome seemingly permanent Muslim occupation. That Byzantine and Western Christian forces could cooperate effectively despite theological and political tensions. These lessons became part of how medieval Christianity understood warfare against Islam. The specific battle might be forgotten, but the pattern it established endured. Which raises the question, if Garigliano established such important precedents and achieved such significant strategic success, why has it been nearly erased from historical memory, while lesser battles fill textbooks? One of medieval Italy's most significant military victories is barely remembered outside specialist academic circles. The reasons why reveal as much about how history is remembered as about the battle itself. The first problem was the sources. Contemporary accounts of Garigliano exist, but they're complicated by the political biases of their authors. The most detailed chronicle comes from Liutprand of Cremona, writing in the Antipodosis roughly 50 years after the battle. But Liutprand had an explicit agenda. Writing in service to the German Emperor Otto I, he sought to delegitimize the previous Roman regime. His portrayal of Pope John X emphasizes scandalous allegations about sexual impropriety with Theodora, rather than military achievement. Liutprand wanted to paint the Roman nobility and their papal allies as corrupt and incompetent, which made celebrating their greatest military success inconvenient for his narrative. The other contemporary sources, the Chronicon of Benedict of Soracte, the Chronicon Comitum Capue, the Annales Beneventani, provide briefer accounts that confirm the basic facts, but don't offer the dramatic detail that makes battles memorable to later generations. The 19th century historian Ferdinand Gregorovius famously described Garigliano as the most glorious national enterprise accomplished by the Italians in the 10th century. But by then, the battle had already faded from popular memory. The second problem was the total annihilation of the defenders. 0 Saracen survivors meant 0 Saracen accounts. If any Muslim chronicles of the battle were written, and it's possible none were, given that the garrison was completely destroyed, they haven't survived. This leaves historians with only Christian perspectives. One-sided sources make it harder to understand what actually happened and why, which in turn makes it harder to construct compelling historical narratives. The third problem was political. The coalition that achieved victory at Garigliano immediately dissolved into the same bitter rivalries that had preceded it. Italian princes couldn't celebrate a victory that still ended in political fragmentation and the murder of its architects. Within 13 years of the battle, Berengar was assassinated, Alberic was murdered, and John X was strangled in prison by the widow of his own military commander. The warriors who destroyed Garigliano destroyed each other. That made the victory politically awkward to commemorate. The fourth problem was ecclesiastical embarrassment. Later, medieval church authorities found the image of a pope personally fighting in battle deeply problematic. The papacy spent much of the later Middle Ages trying to emphasize spiritual authority over temporal power, trying to position itself above secular warfare. Pope John X, fighting alongside his troops, contradicted that carefully constructed image. Better to minimize or forget that uncomfortable precedent than to celebrate it. The fifth problem was the nature of the victory itself. Garigliano wasn't a dramatic battlefield clash with heroic charges and impossible odds overcome through courage. It was a 3-month siege followed by systematic slaughter of trapped, starving defenders. That's militarily impressive, but narratively less compelling than battles where smaller forces defeat larger ones through tactical brilliance. The victory was thorough, but it wasn't the kind of story that fires imagination. Modern academic scholarship has begun recovering Garigliano's significance. Researchers like Marco Di Branco have worked to reconcile the limited textual sources with archaeological evidence and Islamic historical context. The battle's importance for understanding medieval Italian military and political history is increasingly recognized by specialists. But popular historical memory works differently than academic scholarship. History doesn't remember significance. It remembers stories, and a 3-month siege ending in complete annihilation, orchestrated by a warrior pope who would be murdered by his ally's widow, was too complicated, too brutal, and too politically inconvenient for medieval chroniclers to celebrate. The battle that should be studied as a case study in coalition warfare, siege tactics, and medieval geopolitics remains largely unknown outside specialist circles. Whether remembered or forgotten, Garigliano changed the Mediterranean world in ways that echo to the present day. The lessons it taught about what organized Christian resistance could accomplish remained relevant long after the specific details faded from memory. Garigliano demonstrates principles that remain relevant to coalition warfare. Diplomatic preparation, enabling military action, land-sea coordination, requiring unified command, and patient siege strategy against entrenched positions. Military historians analyzing the campaign note that success required extensive political groundwork before a single sword was drawn. The coalition-building phase lasted longer than the actual siege. Pope John X spent months negotiating with rival princes, offering incentives to former enemies, convincing coastal cities to abandon profitable arrangements with the very forces they would fight. That diplomatic preparation was as crucial as any tactical decision during the battle itself. Modern coalition operations, whether NATO actions or United Nations peacekeeping, face similar challenges. Building consensus among allies with competing interests often determines success more than battlefield tactics. The coordination between Byzantine naval forces and Italian land armies demonstrated the effectiveness of joint operations centuries before combined arms warfare became military doctrine. Nicholas Piccini's fleet didn't just support the land campaign. It made victory possible by doing something no previous attempt had achieved. Complete maritime isolation of the target. Modern amphibious operations and joint force planning follow principles that Garigliano exemplified. Naval power and ground forces must be synchronized under unified command. Supply lines must be protected, and blocking reinforcement can be more important than direct assault. The technological advantage of Greek fire parallels the role of decisive technology in modern warfare. The Byzantine secret weapon didn't just provide tactical advantage. It created psychological effect that prevented enemies from attempting tactics that might otherwise have been viable. Modern military technology, from precision-guided munitions to stealth aircraft, functions similarly. The mere presence of superior technology can deter enemy action without being directly employed, perhaps most significantly for modern analysis. Garigliano demonstrates that leadership credibility requires shared risk. Pope John X's willingness to personally fight alongside his troops had measurable effects on coalition cohesion. When political leaders demonstrate they're willing to face the same dangers they ask others to face, it fundamentally changes how those forces operate. The historical record shows John's personal participation wasn't just symbolic. It helped maintain unity among forces that had every reason to fracture back into regional rivalries. The patience demonstrated during the 3-month siege contrasts with modern expectations of rapid results. In an era of instant communication and 24-hour news cycles, sustained operations that show no immediate dramatic results face political pressure to produce quick victories. Garigliano succeeded precisely because commanders understood that some objectives require patient, sustained pressure rather than dramatic assault. Siege warfare's fundamental principle that controlling resources and maintaining pressure eventually forces capitulation remains valid even when it's strategically unglamorous. The campaign's aftermath offers a cautionary lesson about the fragility of coalitions once their unifying purpose is achieved. The Christian League that seemed impossible to create proved equally impossible to maintain. Within years, the coalition members were fighting each other. Modern military alliances face similar challenges. Maintaining unity after the immediate threat is defeated often proves harder than winning the initial victory. But perhaps the most important lesson from Garigliano isn't military at all. It's about what happens when people who have every reason to fight each other find a reason to fight together. For 3 months in 915, fragmented Italy became something it almost never was: united. That unity didn't last. It never does. But for one summer, facing an existential threat, bitter enemies became allies. And together, they achieved what none could have accomplished alone. So what do we take from a forgotten battle fought 1,100 years ago by men whose world is incomprehensible to ours? A pope with a sword. That image should be impossible. In August 915, according to multiple contemporary sources, it was real. Pope John X personally led Christian forces in battle, an act so unprecedented that later church authorities tried to forget it happened. But it did happen, and what happened at Garigliano changed the Mediterranean world. Let's be clear about what the historical record actually shows. 30 years of Saracen occupation, documented from 881 to 915 in multiple sources. The systematic destruction of Monte Cassino and San Vincenzo al Volturno, chronicled in monastic records with dates and details. A 3-month siege from June to August 915, confirmed across Christian chronicles. Complete annihilation of the Saracen garrison, explicitly stated in contemporary accounts that all were captured and executed. An imperial coronation as political reward, verified in multiple historical sources on December 3, 915. And the end of permanent Islamic territorial presence in central Italy, demonstrated by the absence of such settlements in subsequent centuries. What we don't know matters too. We don't have precise troop numbers for either side. The chronicles simply didn't record them. We don't have hour-by-hour tactical accounts of how the siege progressed or how the final battles unfolded. We don't have Saracen perspectives because they all died, and if they wrote about Garigliano, those accounts didn't survive. We don't know exactly where the Kai ruins stood, though archaeological surveys suggest the general area. History gives us outlines, not photographs. The gaps in our knowledge remind us that even well-documented medieval battles remain partially mysterious. But what we do know is enough to understand why Garigliano matters. Not because it was the biggest medieval battle, it wasn't. Not because it's well remembered, it's nearly forgotten. It matters because it proved something that medieval Europe desperately needed to learn: that fragmented Christian powers could unite against existential threats, that maritime and land forces could coordinate complex operations across months of sustained campaigning, that patient siege warfare could overcome seemingly permanent occupations, that victory was possible when it had seemed impossible. The men who won at Garigliano mostly died badly. Berengar I, crowned Holy Roman Emperor as reward for his participation, was assassinated by his own men in 924. Alberic I, who led cavalry charges against Saracen positions, was murdered by his enemies between 924 and 926. Pope John X, the warrior pope who personally fought in the battle, was deposed, imprisoned, and murdered in 928 by Marozia, the widow of Alberic, his own ally. The coalition that had seemed impossible to create dissolved into the same bitter rivalries that preceded it. In that sense, they won the battle, but lost the peace. But the Saracens never re-established permanent bases in central Italy. The Via Appia remained in Christian hands. The monasteries rebuilt, slowly recovering the intellectual and spiritual centers that raids had destroyed. And when Pope Urban II called for crusade 180 years later, he followed, consciously or not, the Garigliano template: papal leadership, multinational coalitions, Byzantine support, religious warfare justified as defensive necessity. In the hills above the Garigliano River, where the toponym Battaglia still marks the site of that August slaughter, nothing visible remains of 915. The marshes have been drained by modern agricultural projects. The Roman ruins that Saracens fortified have crumbled further into the earth. The river flows as it always has, indifferent to the blood once spilled on its banks. But historical memory works differently than geography. The battle that deserves to be studied as a masterclass in coalition warfare is almost forgotten. The Pope who personally led troops has been sanitized by later church historians into a purely spiritual figure. The total victory became politically inconvenient for victors who murdered each other within a generation. Garigliano disappeared from popular history because it was too complicated to celebrate, too brutal to romanticize, and too embarrassing for both secular and ecclesiastical authorities to commemorate. Yet the fact remains. For one summer in 915, the impossible happened. A warrior pope assembled enemies into allies. A fragmented Italy achieved unity. A 30-year occupation ended in a single day of systematic slaughter. And the Mediterranean balance of power shifted in ways that would echo across centuries, establishing precedents for Christian military coordination that would influence conflicts from the Crusades to the Reconquista. That's the story of Garigliano, a battle too significant to forget, too complicated to celebrate, and too uncomfortable to teach. But now you know, and knowing matters, even when history tries to forget. The lessons of coalition warfare, patient strategy, and unified purpose transcend the specific circumstances of 9th century Italy. They speak to any age where divided powers must find common cause against common threats. The warrior pope and his impossible coalition prove that it can be done. The question is whether we'll remember how, or continue to forget the battles that taught us.